Hey everyone, welcome back to the Honestly podcast. I'm excited because today we are doing our very first book club episode, which is where we take some time and dive into a book that I think is significant for all of us in our spiritual walks. So today we are going into the book With by Skye Jethani. So this is going to be a really good, I won't say deep dive, but we're going to kind of walk through overview, main points, key points, a little bit of why it matters, taking it, into practice for all of us. So this is a book that I first read in my time in undergrad at Taylor University. And it was something that as I read it, I just knew that this was a book that it was going to change my life. It was very significant. It was very challenging, but in the most welcoming way, if that makes sense. It wasn't angry or mean or divisive, but it was very clear and obvious and scriptural and pastoral in a good way. So the overview, the big point of this, I don't want to say the big point of why we do book club is on Honestly. This is a place where we, as we say in the topic or the description, we talk about culture, theology, following Jesus, church, all those things. And it's fun to kind of drop the word honestly, like, honestly, I think this book would be really good for you, which is true. But the reason we add book club in there is, beyond just stories, which have not rolled out yet. And, some of the discussions that we've had is because not everyone has time to read all these books. Hopefully there are some people that do book clubs that aren't me, that have read books I haven't read. But I also think it's significant that as we want to talk about our Christian lives in a more honest way, our faith in a more honest way, talk about Jesus in a more honest way, having other pieces to that puzzle, other opinions, other perspectives, I think that is significant as well. So that's why we're going to be adding book club episodes, about one book a month, so that we all have a little bit of a different perspective. And this isn't even my perspective. This is, I'm kind of distilling the book for all of the listeners, but this is written by Skye Jethani and influenced me. And hopefully this influences others and influences our discussion. So that is why we do book club. That's why we're bringing these in here. It's not just because books are fun, though that is true. It's because, they have these ideas have a very significant influence on our spiritual, personal lives. We're all interconnected. So that's the core piece of it. So the overview of this book, is we're often left with many questions and problems in our faith. If you're like me, you might have been in church for a while and you had questions and curiosities, but you didn't have all the answers, or you were looking for answers, couldn't find any, or whatever. Jethani's main perspective is what posture we take toward God is significant in our faith journey. So we are meant to posture ourselves in a way that aims to live life with God. Okay, so that posture, we're going to go into this. He has 4 typical postures that we tend to align ourselves with. But when he says posture, it's how we approach God, how we see God, understand God, relate to God, engage with God. There's a lot to this. It's not just, it's not just about, do I stand or sit when I worship? That's not really the posture he's talking about. It's a bit more, internal posture, a heart posture, how we orient ourselves toward God and, toward receiving God, all these things. So his main argument in this book is the goal of our faith is to learn to live our lives with Jesus. And he emphasizes the goal is Jesus. Jesus is not an avenue towards something else. Jesus is the goal. Okay, so some key points, and then we'll jump into them, and then we'll go into the second portion of the book, which really talks about living life with God and what that means. So Jethani outlines 4 postures that we typically gravitate to in the Christian life. The first is life for God. Okay, so before I even get into this, if you haven't picked up this book before, I would encourage that you do, or maybe even Google it. He has these fun little doodles. That's kind of a big piece of his work over time, where he just draws these little, honestly, it looks like, first grader just kind of draws something. It's really stick figures and shapes and smiley faces, but it's amazing because they're incredibly, incredibly helpful to be able to just see, oh, okay, that's what he means. In life for God, or life under God, he has one for each posture. So life for God, serving God requires sacrifice, which we believe is true, but the life for God posture takes this so far that changes the phrase to serving God requires sacrifice of absolutely everything. Everything should be sacrificed for God. This is many ministries, many Christians today. As a pastor, I see this in the burdens and fears of pastors, that they don't care for their families, they don't care for themselves. It was interesting. I was talking to a gym owner the other day, and he talked about how in the fitness world, there's a funny mantra that the best way out of shape is to buy a gym, because you're always busy working and talking to people, and you never actually get time to exercise. And I think that's the same here. We see this with pastors, but I think it's true for other people wanting to be quote unquote good Christians. Is the fastest way out of relationship with God is trying to do everything for God. And what's really sad is, in the perspective of a pastor, these burdens and fears of the pastor are then transferred to those in a church community. So you may have been raised like me in a church that really emphasized this life for God mentality, and that was given to all of us that were learning from those people, that everything had to be sacrificed. I remember as a kid that I had this weird back and forth in my head about reading scripture. I'm like, well, if the Bible is the most important thing, why wouldn't I just spend all of my waking hours reading the Bible over and over and over again? Like, why would I even do anything else? Isn't that what the ideal Christian life is meant to be? And obviously that's not true. And if you read scripture, that really points to other things. But this is that idea that everything falls under what I do for God. Okay. Now we're going to talk about sacrifice later. So it's not that there is no sacrifice, but it's the absoluteness of this. Everything is for God to the nth degree without anything coming back. I am just meant to give everything and be lost, be desolate as a human. The second posture is life from God. These are like the consumer cosmos is kind of the phrase he uses. It's this belief that God gives me, whatever I'm looking for. It's the people that, not, I don't have any individuals in mind, but those that pray for God to, give them this, name it and claim it, maybe, the things that, hey, this is all about me, but God is orienting my own life. The thing about this posture is it leaves us empty, and I've seen that, I've experienced that, obviously the author talks about that, but when all of my own faith is actually about God orienting my life the way I want it, which it's not like we can choose that. That's just the belief that we have. It does leave us empty. This is pretty typical if you go back to the episode we had about centering Jesus. This is pretty typical of a fuzzy community, a community that doesn't really want to step on toes, wants to elevate tolerance. Life from God is very common in communities like that. The third posture is life under God. So the definition of this would be God's blessing follows right practice. This is still very common today. This is the legalistic church, or going back to that centered episode, a typical bounded community. If I do X, Y, or Z, then God's blessing is going to follow. And there is a little bit of that. I don't think any of these postures alone are 100% false, but I think that's kind of his point as we get to that fifth posture in just a few minutes, that any of these on their own, like there is a level of sacrifice, there is a level of the Lord giving us good gifts. There is, the necessity of obedience and following the Lord, but it's when all of these things are the most important thing. So that's where we get the legalistic church. It makes me think of the Pharisees in the New Testament and, the law in the Old Testament. The law wasn't bad. It was what happened within the people as they utilized and inappropriately utilized the law. Jesus talks about fulfilling the law, not abolishing it. So I think that's where this, these postures, it's not about removing 100% of these pieces. It's where have these things been distorted? And that fourth one is life over God. The good life is following the right principles. It's the watchmaker mentality where God, he's kind of this deity up in the sky, and he put together this watch, and he like twisted it to get it started and let it go, and it's just running on its own. And God is removed totally from life. Each of these postures treats God as something other than who he actually is. And that's kind of that's what I was saying about there are pieces of these that are kind of true. Like there are good principles in life. There is the necessity to be obedient and follow the Lord. There is the reality that God blesses and wants to give gifts. There is the beauty and necessity of service and sacrifice, but all of these postures treat God in a different way of his identity. So why does this matter? Our understanding of God is essential to our spiritual lives and growth. I'm going to say that again because that's really important, not just for everyone listening, but that's been important for me. Our understanding of God is essential to our spiritual lives and growth. If we are living in one of those four postures, one of those other postures besides living with God, we think that God or Christianity doesn't quote unquote work, but in reality, our posture is what needs adjusting. Have you ever met one of those people, they came to church and they were on fire and something happened? It could have been a major life trauma. It could have been, something more minor. It could have been honestly just, they didn't get something they wanted. And they're like, yeah, this doesn't really work for me. That's usually the word I hear. It's not working. But the truth is that the problem is not with God, or I would even argue true Christianity, but in reality, our posture is what needs adjusting. Our God is communal. Orienting our lives toward being with him is at the core of the good news, which is the gospel. This is the difference between communication and communion. I think a lot of times we tend to limit, and I'm the first at the front of this line, to limit my engagement with God to communication. I'm going to tell God what I need. I'm going to, tell God what I think, what I believe. I'm going to talk to him about these other people, X, Y, and Z, and I'm communicating to him. Not bad. And I think there's even another step of that where I'm trying to listen to God. And I think that's also a very good thing. I'm not going to stop doing that. But it's a communication versus the argument here. And I really believe that the biggest truth that comes out of Skye's work is we're not just meant to communicate, we're meant to commune. We're meant to live life with God. I think about, being married to Kaylee, and we do communicate. We communicate a lot. But it would be a bizarre marriage if we communicated and then she went and lived in the house next door. We don't live in the same home. We have a daughter, but we kind of share. That's not communing. We live in the same home. We're together, and that's the difference of life with God. Is we're meant to engage with God, not just talk to and from, though that is a big piece of it. It's this deeper sense of engaging God with my whole person. And that engagement, that communing, can then, touch these other pieces that these postures really idolize in God. Life over God idolizes principles. Life under God idolizes right practice. Life from God idolizes self and God's gifts, life for God, idolizes mission and sacrifice. When we're able to remove those idols and actually commune with God, we can still engage those things, engage right practice, good principles, God's gifts, service, but Jesus is still at the center, and that engagement, that communing with God is the most important thing. That's what's core, not those other things which are on the periphery a bit more. So then after Jethani goes through, he has a chapter on each of those 4 types, and then he jumps into the life with God, and then he moves into the final 3 parts of this, where he outlines faith, hope, and love. And I want to talk about how, what he says, life with God results in and leads to life with faith, life with hope, and life with love, which are amazing. But that's also where we really see these changes, I think, in our individual lives when we begin to engage these 3, maybe not as every change, but maybe the beginning of change. So life with faith, he talks about how faith replaces the cycle of danger, fear, and control. And then control leads back to danger. He quotes Henry Nouwen, which if you haven't read any of him, he is a fascinating guy. I would encourage you to read. I believe In the Name of Jesus it's an incredibly short book, maybe like 60 pages with wide margins and pretty big font. But it's a great read. Henry Nouwen. But Nouwen says control is an illusion. Control is an illusion. We must live knowing there is someone to catch us, like a trapeze artist. And he talks about how, they give the illustration that there's something amazing in the trapeze artist that flies, but he said that the true crux of it is the one catching them. Yeah, the one who flies has to, reach, has to go, has to trust, but they're not 100% in control. They're not in control of if they're caught and go on to the next trapeze. So that's how we are with the Lord. We have to release at times, but we have to live knowing there's someone to catch us. And when we do that, we move from the danger, control, fear cycle to a cycle of faith, surrender, and safety. Think about that. You have faith, and because I have faith in the Lord, I'm able to surrender whatever he's asking me or whatever I need to surrender. And after I release that, standing vulnerably, open-handed, I'm now in a position of safety because the Lord is going to catch me. Faith, surrender, safety replaces danger, fear, control. Danger, fear, control. Faith is also trust, which is a sidebar. I know this is one of those pieces of faith or of Christianity that is under talked about and over talked about, and probably the most difficult thing is, are we actually trusting the way I trust, my chair to hold me? Do we trust in the Lord, or do we just say, yeah, we have faith? So life with God is predicated on 2 things. This is back to Jethani. Treasuring God above all else, and life for those who live with God never ends. I think that is something that I tend to overlook, even that, yes, there is the eternal, and I talk about the eternal, but it still seems like a secondary, or it's something different, but it's the truth that I treasure God above all else, and then my life will never end. Life with God will never end. So instead of waiting to have life with God later, why don't we just accept his invitation to have life with him now? Okay, life with faith. Second is life with hope. Hope is the opposite of despair. He says, hope is the opposite of despair. He talks about the story of hope in 4 parts. God creating order from chaos. This is Genesis account, the beginnings. God creates order from chaos. Humanity rebelling and plunging back into chaos. Okay, and he has little doodles of all these too, so this is great. Humanity rebelling and plunging back into chaos. God present with us in the chaos of the world. Okay, and that's where we are now. God is present with us in the chaos that humanity plunged back into. And then the 4th part is evil and chaos are vanquished in the new creation. That's the story of hope in 4 parts, according to Jethani. As people, we need hope. This is the dignity of walking with God. We don't need another practice or religion. We need hope. I fully agree. We need to hope in something more than just right now, something that is greater, something that is coming. We need hope, and that hope is God, and that hope of God gives us dignity. And we're able to experience that hope when we commune with him and we interact with him, and we're not just praying to the big eye in the sky or just following some lifeless practices, but we're communing with God, and that communion leads to hope. I have faith that God is going to come through, and I have hope that things are going to be better now and in the future when evil and chaos are vanquished in the new creation. Life with hope follows life with faith, and he ends with life with love. Love is the culmination of a life surrendered to God that totally treasures God. Let me say that again. Love is the culmination of a life surrendered to God that totally treasures God. I think that is absolutely beautiful. Sometimes we talk about love as, just another command to follow, but I really think love is the way we see God. It's another posture. It's the culmination of a life surrendered. So I pray that as I walk with the Lord, I'm better to love when I'm 50 or 60. I'm better at loving people in the future than I am now, because I have more years of surrender, more years of treasuring, and that intimacy allows me to receive the love of God and then give that love to someone else. He dives into the practices a little bit, which I think is super fun. He talks about in silence and solitude, which are so sparse in our day and age. I would encourage you to find some of those. In silence and solitude, we can stand in our worth from God. We don't need to work to receive worth from God. That goes back to that first posture. Well, probably the first and the third posture. Life for God and life under God. We don't need to work. We don't need to make noise. We don't need to shout so loud that we have to drown out the sound of words shouting our unworthiness. No, we can stand in silence and solitude in our worth from God. And it's cool. He makes another cycle out of here, and he's using some sound. So this is actually going to be a little difficult on audio, so we'll see how it goes. But he says, this leads us to the cycle of silence, ah, aha, and ha-ha. So this, he gives better descriptors. A cycle of love, that's silence, wonder, kind of the A-H-H, discovery, aha, and joy, ha-ha. So love, wonder, discovery, and joy. And this repeats. This is the cycle of love that he talks about that comes from a life with God, that we love and receive love from God, and that leads to this wonder of realizing who God is. And I say that because it's a recurring theme. You don't just learn who God is once. God's infinite. We are infinitely learning and wondering about who God is. Then we discover something new, something about us, something about him, something about life. And then there's this joy that comes in that process. And it's not always, I don't think it's always as easy as that, cycle says. It's not just an upward arc toward joy. Sometimes that discovery piece for sure is really difficult. But when we are living a life with love, this is what repeats: love, wonder, discovery, and joy. And he says, love is the greatest gift of the Spirit. All right, I'm going to read a quote from page 168. He says, if we return to Nouwen's trapeze analogy, we can see the transient nature of both faith and hope. Faith is the courage to release the trapeze, trusting that the catcher will rescue us. Hope is the peace and assurance we experience as we soar untethered through the air, knowing the catcher will not let us fall. But once we are caught, once we are safely and fully in his grasp, faith and hope disappear. All that remains is the love between the catcher and the caught. Quote, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. 1 Corinthians 13, 8 through 10. So that's a quote from page 168, and I love that we have this, faith, hope, and love, and these are great. They're great things, but I think he dissects that analogy perfectly. That this trapeze analogy, that faith is the courage to release, hope is the assurance we experience as we're untethered, knowing that we won't fall and we'll be caught. But once we're there, we're in God's grasp. There's just love. In trying to discover who God is, with the shortcomings of the first four postures, we're also trying to discover who we are. And I think this is where he wraps up the book in something that I think really is, more of an invitation to another deep conversation rather than a nice little bow on the end of this one. But he talks about two things. Identity cannot be fully known in this time, and identity comes from communion with God. I think that first, identity cannot be fully known. That's, as we, are fully in presence of Jesus in, the time to come, there's going to be more fully known in there that I just can't understand right now. But the second piece, that is something that we can actively engage with, not like work for, but that's something that is present now, is that identity comes from communion with God. The more I learn about God, the more I learn about myself. And that's what he's pointing back to, those first four postures. All four of them are trying in an unsuccessful and self-centered way, trying to discover not just who God is, but who we are. In life for God, am I the one to sacrifice everything and to just give everything but sustain myself? Because if I give everything and I'm never receiving, I'm still maintaining who I am. Life from God, am I God? Am I, the center of the universe? Am I the most important? Life under God, am I just kind of an unimportant human? Well, I have to do this because, God is God and I don't matter and I need to, just make this happen because I'm insignificant. Or life over God, am I, kind of just working within this, equation almost, and just trying to pull the right strings because I'm kind of this puppeteer. Who are we? I think Jethani would end with that question of, this is what we're discovering, and we are learning that we discover who we are as we discover who God is. And I think that pairing is amazing because that's what communion is. It's togetherness. It's walking side by side. It's walking with, I imagine, holding hands with God. And finding our own identity, which is not necessarily the core piece of this. I still think, we go back to that main point. The goal of our faith is to learn to live our lives with Jesus. The goal is Jesus. And I don't think he's going back on that at the end of this book. I think he's saying the goal is Jesus, and a byproduct of that, such a beautiful byproduct of that, is that we also get to learn who we are. So I think that is a beautiful thing. And I think if you have time, I would encourage you to read this book. It is so good. This is one of the few books I've actually bought and handed out copies of, instead of just loaning my own. It's like, you need to read this. It is so good. Even if you just take those 5 postures and you say, okay, for me, am I living my life for God, from God, under God, over God, or with God? And I think sometimes we kind of oscillate. No one's ever, you don't get into the, I live life with God and the others are no problem. I think sometimes we ebb and flow into those other ones, and the goal is to spend as much time as absolutely possible in living life with God. Some of our past and history might affect some of that. Where am I, drawn to? But in reality, I think as we move and we talk about our spiritual lives honestly and truthfully, and we want to take next steps in our spirituality with Fresh Wind, with whatever church you're part of, whatever that is, we begin like we did, in this podcast, Jesus at the center. Okay. And when Jesus at the center, we don't just communicate. Lesson here, we commune with God. And that's the goal. It's not some other thing. Communion with God is the goal. And hey, blessing, we get to learn more about ourselves as we do that. That is just amazing to me. It's beautiful. I love it. I hope you can see the beauty in it and are able to take some of these pieces into your own life. Maybe take some time to pray and ask the Lord today, like, hey, Lord, where am I just communicating with you? And where are you inviting me into communion? Lord, what am I learning about you that also teaches me about me? So, love this book. Love that you guys spent some time listening to it. We'll talk to you next time.